Welcome to Pre-Algebra, Chapter 1, Section 1. Before we start, take a minute to complete the warm-up problems on your Cornell notes. Today's objective is to learn to evaluate algebraic expressions. Our essential question for Section 1, how do I evaluate algebraic expressions given the value of the variables? You can see we have several vocabulary terms to go through: variable, coefficient, algebraic expression, constant, evaluate, and substitute. Let's start with a variable. A variable is a letter that represents a value that can change or vary. So we choose a letter from the alphabet and we let it represent a value. The coefficient is the number that is multiplied by the variable. In this example, 30n represents 30 times n. 30 would be the coefficient, n would be the variable. Remember, very important, every problem that we do, we have to follow order of operations. PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, is a familiar phrase that you may have heard. If you've come up with your own, that's great, or maybe a teacher came up with a different one. What those stand for: parentheses, exponents, multiply, divide, add, and subtract. Let's pause for a minute to complete problems number 1 and 2 in your notes using order of operations. Moving on. An algebraic expression has one or more variables in it. An example of that could be x plus 6. A non-algebraic expression contains all numbers. So an example could be 35 plus 4. In the algebraic expression x plus 6, 6 is called a constant because it does not change. So when you think of a variable, think of a letter. When you think of a constant, think of a number. To evaluate an algebraic expression, substitute a given number for the variable and find the value of the resulting numerical expression. In other words, see what it equals. Evaluate is another term that means just go through the process to find an answer. Take a second to write an example of an algebraic expression in your notes. Let's continue on with our examples. Evaluate each expression for the given value of the variable. Since we see that word evaluate, that tells us that we need to substitute a value in for the variable that we're given. So in this example, we have x minus 5 for x equals 12. Since x equals 12 is the value we're given, let's substitute 12 in for x, and now it becomes 12 minus 5. And 12 minus 5 is 7. Next example, 2y plus 1 for y equals 4. Remembering that 2y means 2 times y. Because 4 is the value given, we plug that in the place of y. And now we would go through the steps following order of operations to multiply and then add. 2 times 4 is 8. 8 plus 1 is 9. One more example. Evaluate each expression for the given values of the variables 4x plus 3y for x equals 2 and y equals 1. This time around we have two different variables with two different values. So we have to be careful. We also notice that we have 4x. Again, that means multiplication, and 3y means multiplication. So when we substitute in for x, we put in the number 2. When we substitute in for y, we put in the number 1. You'll notice that we use parentheses. It's a little bit easier to read with parentheses than it is if you use the multiplication dot or the x. Now that we're using a lot of variables, we want to be careful not to use that x for multiplication anymore. And the dot works well but can easily be confused with a decimal if we don't write it correctly. So let's continue with our process. Now we follow order of operations. We have multiplication in two parts. We have 4 times 2, and then we have 3 times 1. So we end up with 8 plus 3 equals 11. An additional example to go ahead and try, 9r minus 2p for r equals 3 and p equals 5. Again, we have multiplication using parentheses. 9 times 3 minus 2 times 5 becomes 27 minus 10, which equals 17. Some tasks to make sure you've completed before you finish the lesson. Make sure your Cornell notes are filled out completely. If you need to go back through and pause, make sure you do that. Review your notes and complete the summary at the bottom of the page before class. Come prepared to take a formative, non-graded lesson quiz on how well you understood the material.